Welcome to Noon Edition on WFIU. I'm your host, Bob Zaltsberg. We're broadcasting from Viewpoint Books, Chapter 2 in Columbus today. We're talking about a lot of things about books with an author, a bookstore owner, and a librarian. We're going to talk about books and authors you might want to consider when you're shopping for the holidays. You can join us on Twitter at WFIU, WTIU News, or you can send us questions using the email address news@indianapublicmedia.org. We'll not be taking any phone calls today, but we'll take your comments and questions those two ways, and also from a live audience that we have here at Viewpoint Books. We have three guests with us. Beth Stroh is the owner of Viewpoint Books and Viewpoint Books 2, Chapter 2. She's our host for the show. We appreciate her being here. Lindsey Bailey is a librarian at the Bartholomew Public Library. Her expertise is in children's literature. And also joining us is Michael Koryta, a Bloomington native and best-selling New York Times author who writes mysteries and suspense books and lots more. So thank you all for being here in person today, and thanks all of you who are joining us over the air. So we're going to talk about books that you might want to look for the holidays. Beth, thanks for having us join you here in your lovely bookstore here in Columbus. I want to give you the chance to just offer a suggestion. What's like one of the best books you read this year?
Best books are really hard to define, but if we're talking about gift books, I do want to point out that we were fortunate in the store to get signed copies, a few left, of Robin Wall Kimmerer's new book, The Serviceberry. And I think I really appreciate this book so much. It's a beautiful book to gift to people. We do have the signed copies left, but most of all, I think it reflects kind of an attitude that we have here at Viewpoint Books, and that is that we are grateful. When you said that you don't normally have a crowd, and those of you listening can't see, but we have many people who showed up today, and they've been showing up for our store for months, for years. We're 51 years old, and so this attitude of gratitude that she talks about in this book and that we cherish at the store makes The Serviceberry one of my favorite books to offer as a suggestion for gifting.
Michael, I'm going to ask you for a suggestion, but I also want you to talk a little bit. I've heard you say things about local booksellers and their importance to you as an author.
Yeah, I mean, it could not be more crucial in a time when there's so many competing demands for attention. And, the fact that people are in here right now instead of on TikTok is a win for society. So thank you for having us. And, we're fortunate in Indiana to have a lot of great independent bookstores. And I encourage everyone to buy their holiday gifts there. The recommendation of The Serviceberry actually makes me think of another sort of bird-related book that I think is a great gift item. Amy Tan wrote a book.
Yes.
She also illustrated. She's embarrassingly, infuriatingly talented. And her illustrations are gorgeous. The text is gorgeous. I think it's just a really nice gift book. And then on the sort of crime thriller side, I see you have The Last One at the Wedding here by Jason Rakulak. And I had the privilege of reading that very early. He was actually still at work on it. He's a really nice guy. He's a wonderful writer. And a book that I would recommend is called Hidden Pictures. Make sure to buy that one in hard copy, not, in my opinion, in audible form or audio form, because the pictures, the drawings, are actually very crucial. And it's a nice, spooky read that you kind of dip into, and then 3 hours go by and you just can't put it down.
Lindsey Bailey deals a lot with children's literature, so give us your number one recommendation or your first recommendation. You can rank them as you go along.
Absolutely. For children?
Yes.
Okay, good, because Beth stole my recommendation for adults, which was The Serviceberry. I love it. Yes, the attitude of gratitude that comes out of that book just makes it a great gift for the holidays. For children, I'm going to have a really hard time naming just one, especially because you think about...
Well, we have an hour.
Oh, we have an hour. Okay, here I go. Get ready. Because kids go through so many different developmental stages, and so what's appropriate for a school-age kid is not going to be the same thing that's appropriate for a preschooler or for a teen or a tween. So I have a couple that I'll share with you. Picture books this year. I read a lot of picture books. I do story times at the library. We get new picture books, and all the time, constantly reading picture books to my own young children as well. I think my favorite picture book this year was probably The Book That Could Read Your Mind. That's by Mariana Coppa. It's a really interactive, entertaining book because it's basically a magic trick in book form. It's one of those books that tells you, hey, here's a picture of all of these people. Look at one. Think about this person. And as you go through, it'll ask you to do other things. And at the end of the book, it always does read your mind. We have tested it. It's amazing. It's really, really fun. Guaranteed winner for
Yes.
Kids who are reading picture books, and even older kids who are still, interested in picture books. It's really, really fun.
And magic. And it
magic,
works.
yes. It's so fun. For school-age kids, man, there's a lot of really good stuff coming out this year. There is a new Dogman book. In case you've been under a rock for the last couple of years, Dogman is the greatest thing in children's graphic novels right now. Big Jim Begins came out earlier this week on Tuesday. It's a Batman parody, unlike most of the other Dogmans, which are more literature-based, the Scarlet Shedder for the Scarlet Letter and so on. This one is a Batman Begins parody, so I'm really excited to read that one when it comes out. Also a surefire win with kiddos. But we also have new Wings of Fire books coming out, one coming out on Christmas Eve, actually. Sure to be a hit with kids. And if you have kids who like reading things that are more serious, there's a fantastic book that came out earlier this year called When We Flew Away. And it's actually a fictionalized prequel to the Anne Frank diary. And it's actually been endorsed by the director of the Anne Frank House. It's by Alice Hoffman. It's supposed to be just wonderful. I haven't managed to read it yet because our copy at the library has been checked out constantly, actually all 3 copies. So I'm really excited about that one as well. And then if we're talking about our tweens, who also fall into that earlier category, but tweens right now are really, really into graphic novels. Everything these days has a graphic novel version to it, whether it's Babysitter's Club or I Survived, Keepers of the Lost Cities. All of these really popular series have now started releasing their books in graphic form. And some of the ones that I think have been really popular, sure to be hits with tweens in this holiday. We've got Berrybrook Middle School books. Anything by Raina Telgemeier is still huge. She's written books Smile and Guts, huge with our tweens right now. And of course, The Last Kids on Earth. Sounds very exciting, maybe a little scary, but the kids love it. So,
All right, thanks. I want to remind our listeners out there that we are having a live show today from Viewpoint Books, Chapter 2 in Columbus, so you can't call us. But you might want to have a pen and paper next to you or your computer because we're going through a lot of authors and books that you might want to consider for your holiday shopping list. We have a question from the audience. We have a couple already. One is, who are the most popular local authors? Now, local could be defined in a couple different ways because we're here in Columbus. Michael is a local and also a national and international author from Bloomington. But who are the most popular local authors? Beth, I'm going to start with you.
In Columbus, we are fortunate to have many very talented authors. Brandon Andrus was here last night for an event, and he has a new nonfiction title out, Deep Calls to Deep, which is a series of reflections that you can use as a guide to better understand yourself and look at ways that you can relate better to others. He has been popular also for his fiction titles. So Brandon would top the list in terms of the local author whose work we've sold most often. Close behind him is Paul Hoffman, and Paul wrote Wicked Columbus, Indiana. He's written a couple of other books too, but that one, especially during spooky season, as we've looked at this building and our other building in terms of spirits that might reside there. His book isn't about that, but it's related to the people in Columbus that you might not hear positive tales about. But
It's
rather,
really good.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but I did an event with him earlier this year, and it was the first time I'd met him, and he gave me a copy of the book, and it's really, really good. I would recommend that.
Yeah. So if you want to know the kind of not so great backstory of our community, that's a really wonderful source. We also have two authors who wrote or actually three authors who wrote fantasies this year that are from Columbus, and their books have sold very well. So Abigail Breyer wrote The Rush of Ravens, and it's an 8-book series. She already has all of the other books outlined, but that's the first one, and she had an event that we helped with and sold many of her books. Just recently, we had E.A. Hendricks, Emily, who came in with her second book in a series, and those are science fiction fantasies. And a former Columbus resident, a young man who grew up here, Brian Sweeney, B.P. Sweeney, came for an opening, and there were as many people stacked into this room then for his book earlier this year too. So all of those have done real well, and we are really proud of supporting our local authors.
Michael, how about people that you know? And Michael lives half the time in Bloomington, half the time in Maine, right?
Yeah, in Maine, there's this upstart, this guy named Stephen King, and I think you're going to hear big things from him. Thinking about Indiana, this gives me an opportunity to plug for the Bloomington Book Festival, which we just launched this year, and it was great. I want to thank everyone who came out for it, but we're really excited to have Ross Gay involved, a wonderful writer, essayist, poet, just a wonderful person. And next year will be October 24th, 25th. We have John Green coming down from Indianapolis. John is just an incredibly gifted writer. He's probably best known for his YA novels that have sold, millions of copies. The Fault in Their Stars, Looking for Alaska, Paper Towns, but also just a brilliant guy. And he has a collection of essays for adults, for anyone, that I would recommend. And I think it's important to remember writers who are no longer with us, too. So I think of James Alexander Thom. You edited him for years, wrote wonderful guest columns for the newspaper. But back in his day, when he would drop one of those 800-page historical epics, those were publishing events. And he was both a really kind, wonderful person and an incredible writer. So I would urge people kind of to go back and find him. And this year, while researching the book that I'm working on under the Scott Carson name, I ended up doing a lot of research about Kurt Vonnegut. And I didn't even realize he had a brother. His brother was a big deal scientist at GE and worked with cloud seeding and weather alteration. And there's a book called The Brothers Vonnegut by Ginger Strand that I just found completely fascinating. So if you're a Hoosier and into nonfiction, I recommend that one.
All right, Lindsey, local authors and also John Green.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, what more is there to say about John Green? I think we all know about John Green. Local authors, obviously at the library, we, aren't having as many big events and things like that, big author fair type deals. But we do have a couple books in our children's department that are by local authors that I've seen circulating fairly well. One, Kimberly Hoffman, actually, related to Paul, obviously, has written a couple of children's books. And the one that I think circulates the best in our collection is about Cleo and Roger, who are two squirrels who are named after Cleo Rogers, whom our library is named after. And they explore the architecture of Columbus. And that one is a continued hit in our collection. I also, Lucky Diaz comes to mind, who we had a joint event with Viewpoint several years back. I'm not sure if Lucky still lives in Columbus. I don't believe that he does.
He doesn't live here anymore, but he has ties to Columbus that are strong. So
Yes, and he has written a couple of children's books. One is Paletero Man, about a popsicle ice cream treat seller. It's wonderful for summer reads. And the one, I
La
can't remember the-
Guitarrista.
La Guitarrista. Yes, it's about a little girl with a guitar. That's just fabulous. And finally, one that's kind of a newer local author is Deepti Vijay Kumar. Recently wrote a book about Diwali and celebrating that here in our community called Fall Brings the Festival of Lights. And we did do an event last month with her at the library that was very well attended and taught lots of kids about Diwali, and it was really, really fun. It's wonderful. Her son is actually the inspiration for the main character, and he was there, and it was a great event. So absolutely wonderful read for anyone interested in that.
Columbus was mentioned in a major bestseller this year. The book is a sequel. It is also titled The Sequel, and I believe the writer's name is Jean Hanf Korlitz. And her first book in this series was called The Plot, and I loved it. It's a great kind of satire of the publishing industry, but it's also a great mystery. And the sequel follows those events. And at one point, there's a murderer who's thinking about a town where she could go and just disappear. And she thinks about, what is that little town in Indiana that's famous for its beautiful architecture? And so I loved that reference to Columbus. So I want to plug that book as well.
I have a story about that because she was making a tour of just a long car trip with her husband, who is also an author and writes about pop music and history of music. And they were traveling through Indiana, and she asked someone where she should stop, and so she came to Columbus, and she walked into the bookstore and said, "Do you have any copies of my book? I'd be happy to sign them for you." And we did have, this was when The Plot came out, we did have that. So I have a feeling
You might be the source material.
we
That's
might
amazing.
be the source material for that, because she mentioned, I didn't know there was this place with all this architecture, and we just walked over to the library and saw that arch sculpture, and so my
Oh, that's
guess
so
is,
funny.
yeah, and I also want to point out my comments about John Green. John Green's next book is nonfiction. He's written the series of essays that you mentioned. His next book will be about polio, right? Tuberculosis. Thank you for that correction. And we had an opportunity, we try to do this whenever we can, to purchase signed copies of John's book. He is tending to sign copies because he actually prefers to do that at home and sign those books and then make them available to independent bookstores, which he absolutely supports. So I want to tell you that when that book comes out next year, we will have signed copies at Viewpoint. We're taking pre-orders for it already, and I feel it will be a very educational and interesting book to read. I always look for science or history that doesn't feel like a textbook and feels like a story, or feels like it has people and realness to it, and John's books are like that. So.
We have a question that's a natural follow-up to this conversation. How do we help promote our local writers? Michael, what kind of help do you, when you were starting as basically a local writer?
Yeah,
what kind of help
I'm thinking of all of the people who hand-sold books for me. That really, when it's a writer you haven't heard of before, it's hard to be convinced to put out $30 to try something new. So the hand selling that comes from local independent booksellers is just crucial. And word of mouth from readers, book clubs, that's crucial. And then obviously, you can't say enough about libraries, because that's where it's a little bit easier to take a risk on a new writer when you have the opportunity to just check out the book and not make the investment. And if you can hook a reader in the library, they might come into the bookstore and buy the work that comes down the line. And so I think it's that chain of booksellers, librarians, and just word of mouth. It's doing what we're doing right now, but on a regular basis with friends, just always talking about the thing you read that made you excited. And that makes, I'm going to go on a little bit of a detour here to children's books. My parents recently adopted a cat from the Monroe County Humane Society. I know, Bob, you're a big champion. And the cat's name is Chester. And Chester was the name of a cat in some of my favorite books as a kid, the Bunnicula series.
Yes.
So we have Bunnicula and Holiday Inn and The Celery Stalks at Midnight. What a great title. And I thought those books were just so funny. The cat, Chester, who is named after G.K. Chesterton, is this very literate,
Very
kind
dry.
of dry, acerbic animal. And then there's the happy-go-lucky Harold the dog, who ostensibly writes the books and then delivers them to his editor in New York. And I love those books. I gave them to my niece a few years ago. She loved them. They hold up across time.
Yes, I just read those to my kids last year. Loved them.
So, same question for you guys. How would you help promote, I guess, or get people aware of local authors?
So if you don't know what hand selling is, it means for a bookseller that you can go to a shelf, you can pull a book off in your hand then, and you can, in an elevator speech or a few words, convince someone that this is a book worth looking at. They may not buy it, but at least looking at it. Because if they don't recognize the author's name, then they may not even give it a few seconds of consideration. So we do a lot of hand selling of local authors. We did used to separate their work, and we found that when it's in the genre that it belongs, that we have a better opportunity to say their work is just as credible as any other writer in that genre. So we have them now in mystery or in children's gift books or wherever, and we can go to those and talk about them. We host signings whenever we can. We actually have more requests than we can manage, especially this time of year, which is a time when everyone would like to have their books being purchased for gifts for family members and things. But we have all of the authors that I mentioned and many more. We've hosted book signings. We do a cider Sunday in our community between Thanksgiving and Christmas where we're open for a few hours. We often host authors at that because it's kind of a quieter shopping experience where they can talk to customers as they come in and tell the story behind their books. I think that's one of the things that makes books really relevant, really important, and more desirable to people is what motivated you to write a book? What was behind this? So we try to do those things to support them.
I love, by the way, that you reference, and I've never heard another bookseller mention this, that you reference how it's better to move the local authors just into the genre in which they write. I do think that it enhances the credibility, and it says, okay, you're worthy of a national following. There is a tendency, I think, sometimes we see, local writers, and it feels as if it's almost a charitable act to support your local artists, but it's like, no, they can be doing really good stuff, too.
Right, it's like saying they belong here.
Exactly, yes, I like that.
This is the audience is great. This is another natural follow-up. So, Michael, this is for you to describe briefly how you came up with main ideas for your books. And I want to expand on that a little bit because I know some of the research you did and some of the things that you've done before writing a book on, the Ridge, for instance. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The Ridge is a good example because I went to the Exotic Feline Rescue Center in Center Point, Indiana, and I just was fascinated with its existence. At the time, they had over 200 tigers and lions down the end of this gravel road in the middle of nowhere, Indiana. And I thought that's a great setting for a novel, but I ended up getting absolutely immersed in the weeds of research. I think it's the journalist in me that I can never, completely eradicate. I like to do the boots on the ground kind of field work, and so I went on these big cat rescues to Texas and Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and ended up, I've darted a lion and a tiger, and I've tangled a little bit with one temperamental lynx. So those kind of experiences are certainly grist for the mill as a writer. The last book I wrote, Lost Man's Lane, was set entirely in Bloomington in 1999. And the research process for that, obviously I know the town, but I just immersed in old newspapers. I spent so much time using the New York Times and the Herald Times archives and kind of looking at what was happening locally in that moment in that day and what was happening nationally. And the way that gave the book texture, I think it becomes more real to me. And I think if it's more real to me, that probably works for the reader as well.
That's one of the books that I would be able to talk about, but since we have Michael, he needs to talk about it. Marshall Miller, was he like were you the model for Marshall Miller?
No, although I've got to admit probably some of the sense of humor overlaps a little bit. When you're writing, you're always trying to create this fictional world, and when you base a character on someone you know, the fiction collapses. So I've always tried to avoid that, but it was really nice to go back in a time capsule kind of way to Bloomington in '99, and even looking at the way the map has changed. I mean, there are obvious things like restaurants I loved that came and went, but to see how much the town has changed was a lot of fun. So Marshall is not, I don't think of him as an alter ego, but there definitely is I share his sense of humor and probably his taste for bad rap music in '99, yes.
And I should say before we move on to some other questions, so a lot of the folks in the audience know you as Michael Koryta. I'm not sure how many of them know you as Scott Carson, which is the author of the book we were just talking about. So I'm sure you've been asked this 100 times more. Why the two different writing names?
Yeah, so I write some, I guess you would call them traditional crime thrillers, and then some that have a supernatural element more in the sort of Stephen King camp. And I thought it might make sense to provide the booksellers and the readers with clear branding of which book is which type. And I also had always had this fantasy of having a name in a word-of-mouth business that people can actually pronounce. So Carson was really refreshing after years of Koryta.
All right. Lindsey, here's a question for you. Why do we distinguish between young adult and other fiction?
That's a fantastic question. And that's somewhat complex, too. A little bit of a loaded question. Honestly, it has to do with subject matter, but also length and just general appeal of the content. There's some books that, while written on, a very, you would think like a grown-up level, the content is going to appeal more to younger adults, and vice versa. Things that you would think would appeal to teens or tweens or things like that are written, but they contain subject matter that is not appropriate for younger children. So a lot of it, mostly is subject matter, I would say.
I think so. I think it's really hard these days because we even have, for instance, books that came out as young adult novels and now they're considered adult novels. And it tends, and they're being printed and published and categorized as that when they come to us, where 2 years ago, 5 years ago when they first came out, they would have been young adult. I think there's a consciousness about how much do we expect a teen reader to grow up in a book with more adult content.
Yes.
And the other thing that we're sensitive to as booksellers is, can we go when, I'm a grandmother, when a grandmother comes to the store and says, I really want to get a book for my granddaughter, and she's 17, and we take her to the young adult section, are we going to embarrass that grandmother by giving her suggestions that might be content that isn't what she really wants her 17-year-old granddaughter to be reading? And that is a really hard line for us to draw. We have books that run, if you're talking about spice, which is how we...
Spice, yes.
Yeah, how we talk about sex in books and romance and all of that kind of stuff. We have books all across the spectrum. And we have readers who want no spice in their novels, and we have readers who will tell us as spicy as you
all
have.
the spice.
Yes, all the spice. And when you're talking about a young adult and making recommendations or encouraging them to read, that's one of those areas where we don't feel we should be making that decision, but we should be informed about it so that we can make good recommendations to people who are buying for those teens.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So-
Yeah, it really reflects changing values in societies and communities, and what might be considered appropriate in one community might be considered very, very inappropriate in another community. And those lines are shifting a lot over time, and it really...
I think, Lindsey, from the library and also from us as a bookstore, although we're less susceptible to it, there's a lot of criticism of some of the books that we have
Yes.
available, that we make
Absolutely.
available. And we are absolutely opposed to banning books and not making those books available to people who want them. And I think that's where we're tested most often, is in the young adult genre.
Yes, 100%.
So which books should we have according to me, you, somebody else who walks in the door, and which shouldn't we have, which is where we have to really consider what recommendations we're making.
Yes, and so I think that's, that label of young adult is helpful in that regard,
Okay.
so people know what they're getting into,
Okay.
or could be getting into, I should say.
Yeah.
You're listening to Noon Edition today. We are live from Viewpoint Books, Chapter 2 in Columbus, so you can't call us, but you can send us your questions to news@indianapublicmedia.org or at WFIU, WTIU News on X. We're talking about books and books for the holidays and all sorts of issues involving books. And here's a good general question. I'm going to turn to Michael first. I'm going to add a little bit to this question. How do we define the purpose of books in a multimedia age? And I also want to get your reaction. 2 of your books have been made into motion pictures. And I want to get your reaction to those experiences.
Yeah, they've been great, and it's so funny because they tend to disappoint the readers inevitably. They say, they ruined your book. And I said, no, the book is still the book. Stephen King told me that, actually. That was his bit of wisdom when Those Who Wish Me Dead came out. He said, remember, it doesn't change the book. It might be a good movie, it might be a bad movie, but it does not change the book. And, I love film, I love TV. I consume media in a lot of different contents. I think what is special about a book is that it is the most active form of audience participation, because you are going into this world, and it involves different regions of your brain. It's not as passive as having the camera feed you the images and the soundtrack help feed you emotions. There are actually some fascinating studies where they've put people through functional MRI scans, and to see different lobes of the brain activate, we can say objectively that readers who read fiction have higher empathy responses than people who are watching a movie, which I think is fascinating. And part of that is because it is the active bridge where you have joined forces with this character. You're feeling their journey. And I think in a world where we could probably benefit from some more empathy and consideration of other viewpoints, it's more important, now than ever to read.
And books, they really let you tell a story in a different way than other media do, because as you're saying, you're inside the mind of the characters. You get their internal dialogue, their feelings, their thoughts that, yes, you can get on a screen in some ways, but they're very explicit in a book. And I think that's part of what builds that empathy, that connection. It's a different way of telling a story.
And we believe that every person should feel that they are represented in a book, that children in picture books should see pictures of people like themselves, and that they should see families who live like theirs do, and they should see communities that are similar to their own, so that they know that they're not alone. As we get older, that representation, if I read a book and it doesn't have any pictures and it describes the characters, that person can be like me. They may not be in the author's mind when they wrote the book, but I can find ways to relate to any character in a book, or to ask myself questions. Why have I never thought of that? Why haven't I taken those same routes in my life, or if I haven't, and it was a conscious choice on my part, I can live through their experience. So books are both mirrors. They should reflect back to us, and we should be able to see ourselves in them, but they should also be windows. They should let us see things that are not part of our experience and help us with the empathy, the development of an understanding of others in this very same way. So.
Beth, I'm going to throw you this one. What makes for a good coffee table book? And in your opinion, are these a good gift?
Well, I have way too many books of all kinds, including coffee table books. The number one coffee table book I would recommend to people this year is American Modern. And it's different from most coffee table books. It's all about Columbus. It's all about architecture, but it's about so much more. It's made in a very unique way. It's not a hardcover, but it's priced like one. I will be honest about that. But a good coffee table book gives you a chance to visually get inside the book, but also I think to learn something about those pictures that you're seeing, to be able to know a place or a person or an event better than you could any other way. So it offers those illustrative examples at the same time that it offers content that informs you. We have a nonfiction book group in the store that I started because I needed hopeful nonfiction and I needed to talk about it with other people. The world is not a very friendly place sometimes, and there's a lot of nonfiction that's very partisan or, just
doom and gloom.
Yes, it is. You can get really depressed by reading a lot of it, or animated or angry or whatever. And so we started this book group, and it's nonfiction, and it's kind of like the same thing that I think a picture or a coffee table book. It brings the hopeful, the beautiful, the informative, the learning side of the world to your table.
All right, I have a couple more questions, one for Michael and one for Lindsey, and then we're going to do sort of a lightning round of book ideas for the holidays. So, Michael, has technology helped or hindered your creativity?
Oh, I'd say it's mostly helped. I mean, my opportunity to go back to the New York Times archive, at my desk, for example, is an easy example of a benefit. All the documents that have been scanned digitally, and the ability libraries have incredible resources now that you can access without even needing to be in the building, which is such a great gift. But it's also a bit of a threat, without question. I mean, we have, I was just traveling, so it's, I think of a plane landing, and then as soon as the plane touches down, I look back, and every face is looking at a phone. We're perpetually scrolling and distracted, and the phone is a great thing, but it's also the great distraction device of all time. So trying to get a book into the reader's hands and the phone out of it is probably a challenge, but in terms of my process, technology has been more beneficial.
Okay. Lindsey, what are some books that started young adult and moved to adult?
That is a good question.
Sarah J. Maas.
I would say Sarah J. Maas's books, and I'm blanking on her name. Rebecca Yarros, The Fourth Wing. That whole series is definitely straddling the line of young adult to adult, just based on content and age of the characters.
Even some classic books.
Some of the classics.
The Giver. Some people think isn't appropriate for. I might have read it in upper elementary school, and now it's middle school or high school. So there's that kind of shift.
Yeah, you've got a lot of other books that straddle those lines too, like Harry Potter, for instance, right? It's those big long series where you have a character who starts off, an 11-year-old, right? By the last book, 17, much darker themes. We've got those books both in the children's department and upstairs in teen, because they
Just
definitely
had it-
cross those lines. And a lot of series take that arc,
Yeah.
like the ones we just mentioned, because you start with a young adult. And, I think that's the core element of a young adult novel is there's some sort of journey of self-discovery and growth of a young adult. But typically by the end of those series, they are adults and making adult decisions and doing adult things. And yeah.
Okay, we're going to get into a quick observations about certain books. I'm going to start. I would say anything by Michael Koryta or Scott Carson. I have to say that. And even the one that has a lawyer named Zaltsberg in it. I recommend that.
And we happen to have many of Michael's titles here.
And one more I want, because I saw it over here. I just finished The Gray Wolf by Louise Penny. Anything by Louise Penny, I would highly recommend.
Yep.
Michael?
Kristen Hanna, The Women, I thought was excellent. And I'm listening right now to a book by Howard Blum called When the Night Falls, or When the Night Comes Falling. And if you're a true crime person, he's writing very elegantly and well about those terrible murders in Moscow, Idaho. So I know there are a lot of true crime buffs out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let's go for your first selections now, and then I'm going to ask you a couple of more specific questions. So, Lindsey.
Sure. So for anyone who's a fan of David Sedaris, who writes a lot of books for adults, very, very funny. He did recently come out with a picture book just this year called Pretty Ugly. If you like dark humor in your picture books, highly, highly recommend. Makes me laugh every single time I read it. But I would be a little wary. I'd take a look at it before you show it to a kid, just in case. The illustrations are something else. One of my favorites this year.
I have a few from my booksellers. We Who Wrestle with God is a Jordan Peterson nonfiction book that, if you know Polly, you know that she reads a lot of nonfiction as well. This is one of our favorite books. Several of our booksellers liked All the Colors of the Dark by Chris Whitaker.
Me too.
Deep,
Loved that.
And so that's another good fiction.
What's it about? I mean, or just a little hint about.
How would you describe it?
It's a little epic in its scope. It spans a whole lifetime, it feels like. Small town, I believe it's Missouri, is where it's set. There's some murder, there's small town drama, there's prison
Mystery.
Escapes, there's all kinds of stuff in this book. But the characters are just wonderful, and their relationships are wonderful, and you get to follow their whole lives. It's just so good.
Deep development.
Okay.
Yes.
Michael, as you ponder another one of your favorite authors or books, I want you to talk about character development and how important is that to you, and who do you decide to keep, and who do you decide that you're going to just drop along the way?
Well, that's a process. Some characters have been killed off in drafts and then suddenly survive and make the final book. So until they go to press, there's a fighting chance for characters. But character development is everything. I mean, story is character. The idea of character in action, and you need a character who wants something, and we understand what they want, and that can shift throughout the course of the journey. But as long as a character wants something and there is an obstacle between them and that thing, then we have something called drama. And as long as there's drama, we're following the story. So I can't outline. I would love to be able to in some ways. But I open with understanding a little bit about the character and the setting and that initial want, that initial desire. And then from there, it's kind of moving into the darkness with the character. And I've always found it much more fun to write without any idea of how the book will end, because it helps put me in the character's shoes. There's that great line from To Kill a Mockingbird when Atticus tells Scout, you need to get in another person's skin and walk around in it. And that's basically my experience as a writer. And I think when a book is working for me as a reader, it's the same thing. I feel immersed in their journey. I don't have to root for them. I can actually be rooting against them. There's some wonderful books that do that well. But as long as I understand very clearly what they're trying to accomplish and what stands in their way, I'm going to hang in with that story.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about people that you read on the mystery side or the suspense side, who do you think does a great job of developing their characters?
Oh boy, there's so many. I mean, Dennis Lehane comes to mind, Michael Connelly, Stephen King, obviously, in those genres. James Lee Burke are all icons for a reason. I think Megan Abbott is someone who people are aware of her now, but the more people read her, they're going to end up being immediately impressed. I think in terms of quick, deft character development, nobody ever did it better than Larry McMurtry. I reread Lonesome Dove this year, and it is this big, sprawling epic with so many characters and so many points of view. And he'd come into a scene, I would say he came into a scene late, usually, and so quickly you understood the dynamics through dialogue and choices, and that's how you hold a reader for whatever that book was, 800 pages, 900 pages.
Mm-hmm. All right. Lindsey, Beth, same kind of question, just people that you really like to read and that whole idea of character development. You were talking about it before.
In children's books, anything by Ryan T. Higgins is a favorite of mine. We have lots of his books, Bruce books, Penelope, the dinosaur books. And I think it's because even for a young child, the characters become real enough that kids can relate to them, enjoy them. I also want to point out Lauren Castillo, who writes for children, the book Our Friend Hedgehog, The Story of Us, introduces animal characters with one human. And you'll never look at a hedgehog again without thinking about the hedgehog in this story and losing its little toy stuffed animal and all these other owls and other characters coming together to help him find it. It makes those sentiments of humans real in animals. So.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to connect to those characters. You have to feel those characters, and that's what keeps you coming back again and again to the books that you love, the books that you enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Absolutely.
Want to switch to nonfiction for the last couple of minutes. Something in the nonfiction genre. I don't read much nonfiction. This year I did read The Real Hoosiers about Oscar Robertson and Crispus Attucks, which I thought told a really interesting story about our state and our capital city that I wasn't as aware of as I probably should have been. So.
Yeah. I had the pleasure of hearing Doris Kearns Goodwin talk about her most recent book, which is An Unfinished Love Story. It is a personal story. She's written about presidents and biographies of them mostly. It talks about the 60s. And I was alive then, but not aware of news at that point. And so I learned a lot about that time frame, but I also learned a lot about a woman who was in a professional career, a woman who married an older man, just a lot of things about her and that time frame that I wasn't aware of. And that's what I look for in nonfiction, is something that informs me and interests me.
Okay.
I love reading nonfiction. It's my favorite, and I really, really love a good celebrity memoir.
There have been a few this year, too.
There have. I'm really excited about the Cher one that just came out. Yeah. And I'm currently reading Lisa Marie Presley's memoir that she wrote with, her daughter Riley Q finished it for her after she passed. And I'm actually looking up right now the name of it, because even though I'm reading it, I am totally blanking on the name. But it is so fun because you really get to dive into a person and a time period and understand what was going on, and I just love it. And yeah, don't wait on me. I am
Michael.
still looking up the name.
Yeah. I read a lot of nonfiction. It's probably more than half of my reading. And top of mind, I think John McPhee is just a wonderful journalist, and he gets down in the weeds, and just everything he does is fascinating. You mentioned celebrity memoirs. Bob Odenkirk's, it's like comedy drama. is a really interesting look at he had such a bizarre career, starting as a writer for Saturday Night Live and then becoming the star of Better Call Saul, doing a lot of different things along the way. And I finally got around to reading The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe, which I had seen the movie, I'd never read the book, and that one, his style is so unique. I would recommend that. There's also an oral history of Saturday Night Live that it's really quick, it's funny, but it shows the drama and tension and just crazy stress of that. And a film adaptation is coming out here shortly, so I'm excited to see that movie.
Okay, we have about a minute to go, so last thoughts. Lindsay?
Well, I want to throw out there, the name of that book is From Here to the Great Unknown. That's the Lisa Marie Presley memoir that I could not remember the name of.
Okay. Beth?
I just say, get someone a book and share it with them.
All right. Well,
Reading is good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good. All right. I think we're about out of time, so I want to begin to thank everybody here, because I definitely want to thank Beth Stroh, again, the owner of Viewpoint Books and Viewpoint Books Chapter 2. It's been a great place to have this conversation. Really appreciate you having us here. I want to thank Lindsey Bailey, the librarian at the Bartholomew County Public Library. Her expertise is children's literature, but obviously she has a lot of other interests in books. And of course, my old friend Michael Koryta, Bloomington native, best-selling New York Times author who writes mysteries and suspense under both his own name and his alter ego, Scott Carson. So, and then we have lots of people from WFIU and WTIU here who have helped us put this show together, and I appreciate all of them. I have to especially give a shout out to Mike Pashkash, our engineer here today, and Peyton Tattersfield, our producer, Benta Boutier, the Columbus native who has been here with us and helping us, and a lot of other folks. So you've been listening to Noon Edition. I'm Bob Zaltsberg. Thanks a lot for joining us today.